The Nazis were notorious archaeologists, but you're not going to believe the kinds of things they tried to find and the places they went, from the snowy mountains of Tibet to the incredible hunt for the Holy Grail. Secret Nazi expedition. In 1938, Heinrich Himmler kicked off a skull-measuring vacation in the Himalayas. It was unlike any vacation you've ever been on. Apparently, being Hitler's right-hand man and architect of genocide wasn't enough for Himmler. He also organized an expedition to Tibet to search for evidence of the so-called Aryan master race. Why? Because Hitler was obsessed. Hitler and Himmler were both absorbed with the idea that a superior Nordic Aryan race once existed, but had been weakened by mixing with other racial groups. Some Nazi theorists even believed that the Aryans were survivors of the mythical city of Atlantis who had migrated to places like Tibet, where they kept their pure bloodlines hidden in the mountains. I'm not sure how much sense that makes. If you were a member of an ancient advanced civilization, would your first move be to go live in a cold, high-altitude monastery instead of, anywhere else? In any case, Himmler created the Ahnenerbe, a Nazi research unit tasked with finding proof of their wild theories. In 1938, he sent 5 SS members to Tibet, hoping they'd return with scientific evidence that the Aryan race was real, powerful, and totally superior. Instead, they mostly harassed locals and took a lot of weird measurements. Weird measurements of people's heads. There were 2 key figures in this operation. One was Ernst Schaefer, a 28-year-old zoologist and a big game hunter who had already been to the Tibet-India border twice. Here's a fun fact about Ernst. He accidentally shot and killed his wife during a duck hunting trip. But don't worry, it didn't end his career, just his marriage. The other was Bruno Beger, an anthropologist and racial theorist. His job was to measure the skulls and facial features of Tibetans to find proof of Aryan traits. He also made face masks of Tibetan people because Nazi science, I guess? Getting to Tibet was the first tough part of the journey, as you can imagine. They had to pass through British-controlled India, which the British weren't thrilled about. The Times of India even ran a headline calling one of them a Gestapo agent, but after some negotiations, they were allowed to travel through India and cross into Tibet. By the end of 1938, the Nazi team had arrived in Lhasa, Tibet's capital, where they were surprisingly welcomed by local officials. They even attended banquets with Tibetan elites, all while carrying swastika flags tied to their mules. Awkwardly, these flags weren't as offensive in Tibet as you might think, seeing as the symbol had long represented good fortune in the country. Once they got there, they started looking for Aryan evidence, but all they really did was mess around. Beger measured the skulls and features of 376 Tibetans, took 2,000 photographs, and made casts of 17 people's heads, faces, hands, and ears. The team collected 2,000 Tibetan artifacts, took 40,000 photos, and filmed tons of footage. What the Tibetans didn't know was that Nazis believed Buddhism had weakened the Aryans who supposedly lived in Tibet thousands of years ago, making them inferior. While Tibetans were showing them hospitality, the Nazis were secretly judging them for just existing. Just as the scientists were settling in for more of their weird research, World War II broke out. Their mission was cut short, and Himmler had them flown back to Germany just before the British could get their hands on them. After the war, Schaefer moved to a castle in Salzburg and hid most of his Tibetan findings. When Allied forces arrived, they found some of it. Many of their artifacts, notes, and photos survived and can still be found in museums and archives in Germany and the US today. So what did the Nazis manage to prove with their grand expedition? Nothing. Tibet didn't hold any evidence of a lost Aryan civilization, and skull measurements don't determine racial superiority. But that didn't stop the Nazis from trying to rewrite history to fit their racist ideology. And this isn't even the weirdest thing you're going to hear in today's video. Don't go anywhere. Forming the Ahnenerbe, SS archaeologists. Remember when Nazis turned archaeology into a propaganda machine? I already mentioned the Ahnenerbe a minute ago, but let's dig into some more of their history. It was the Ahnenerbe who was behind almost all of the Nazis' bizarre archaeological missions. Founded in 1935 by Heinrich Himmler, the institute's job was to scientifically prove that the Aryan race had single-handedly built civilization many thousands of years ago. On paper, Ahnenerbe's goal was to use exact scientific methods to study the past. Sounds respectable on paper, but in reality it was a myth-making factory whose job was to cherry-pick, distort or straight-up invent history that fit Hitler's favorite bedtime stories. Specifically, the story where tall, blonde-haired superhumans from Northern Europe created everything good in the world. Unfortunately for Hitler, actual historians and archaeologists had found zero evidence that a master race had built civilization. Instead of rethinking their bad science, the Nazis decided the solution was more Nazis doing bad science. At first, the Ahnenerbe focused on ancient texts, engravings, and folklore, scouring old myths for anything that could be twisted into Nazi-approved nonsense. But in 1938, Himmler decided that wasn't enough. He absorbed the SS's excavations department into the Ahnenerbe, meaning Nazi archaeologists could now dig up artifacts and interpret them however they wanted. They sent teams to 18 excavation sites across Germany, including an ancient hill fortress in Prussia and a Viking trading post near Denmark. The goal was to prove that Nordic ancestors were the world's original geniuses. Never mind that Vikings, Celts, and prehistoric Germanic tribes were all vastly different cultures. No, the Ahnenerbe wasn't exactly big on historical accuracy. One of the Institute's most ambitious researchers, Aryan claimed he could trace Aryan origins all the way back to the Ice Age, when woolly mammoths and cave bears roamed the land. And yet I can hardly trace my heritage past my grandpa. According to Nazi science, their mythical master race was hanging out with prehistoric animals like some kind of blonde-haired Flintstones. The Ahnenerbe wasn't just about pseudo-historical nonsense. It was a key part of the Nazi propaganda machine. By rewriting history, they were trying to justify their horrific ideology and war crimes. And the scariest part is that some of their fake research is still cited by modern extremists today. And now for a quick break. But first, I wanted to give a shout out and big thank you to Davey Burke and Joanna Ardia for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Nazis and the Lost City of Atlantis. You might think the whole Indiana Jones versus the Nazis thing was pure Hollywood fiction, but in reality the Nazis really were that obsessed with ancient myths, lost civilizations, and magical artifacts. And one of their biggest fixations was Atlantis. Heinrich Himmler and his SS goons spent years and tons of resources trying to prove that Atlantis was real and that its survivors were the ancestors of the so-called Aryan master race. Plato first wrote about Atlantis in 330 BC, describing it as a powerful island civilization that tried to invade Athens in Greece, only to be sunk by the gods for its arrogance. Most modern historians and scholars say the Atlantis story was nothing but allegory. The Nazis took it way too seriously. In Nazi mythology, Atlantis was an advanced Aryan civilization, a utopia of tall, blonde-haired godmen who, after their homeland sank, supposedly spread their superior genes across the world. This ideology was promoted by Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels. He was an Austrian mystic who published weird, racist pulp magazines claiming that superior Aryans once ruled the world. Hitler himself had read his work in 1909 and was inspired by it. Himmler was a full-blown conspiracy theorist who wanted to turn the SS into a cult-like brotherhood of Aryan warriors. His vision was a new religion based on ancient Nordic gods, sun worship, and racial purity. What a bizarre mishmash of ideas. To make the myth real, Himmler needed scientific proof of the Aryans' glorious past. So, after establishing the Ahnenerbe, Himmler sent his goons all over the globe looking for evidence of Atlantis' survivors. Tibet was the first stop, but not the last. Himmler became convinced that the lost city of Atlantis was in South America, at one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the world. The Nazis and Tiwanaku. If you were on the hunt for the lost city of Atlantis, where would your first stop be? For the Nazis, their desperate search for Atlantis had their attention fixed on Tiwanaku in Bolivia. 1500 years ago, Tiwanaku was the beating heart of a powerful Andean empire. At its peak, Tiwanaku boasted up to 50,000 people, roughly the population of a packed stadium, except instead of watching football, they were herding llamas and building marvelous megaliths from stone. When 19th century European travelers saw these massive stone ruins sprawling over 1,000 acres, they were in awe. They could have attributed the amazing ruins to the indigenous people in the area, but they didn't. Europeans thought the indigenous people were too dumb to make such grandiose structures. So they dreamed up a fantasy. They claimed it was the Egyptians who built Tiwanaku. Francis de Castelnau, a French explorer with more confidence than logic, suggested Tiwanaku was the work of ancient pharaohs. He thought Egyptians took casual road trips across the Atlantic and built little colonies in South America. Modern scholars know this wasn't true. Tiwanaku was 100% a masterpiece of the Andean people who have been living in South America for a very, very long time. But bad ideas have a way of sticking around like gum on a shoe, mutating into even crazier theories over time. Which brings me to the Nazis. In the 1930s, Heinrich Himmler, the creepy wizard of Nazi ideology, funded an expedition to Tiwanaku. The mission, just like the mission to Tibet, was to prove that an ancient Aryan master race had built the city over 1 million years ago and named it Atlantis. The man leading this bizarre quest was Edmund Kiss, a German contractor, novelist, and a professional conspiracy theorist. According to Kiss, the so-called Aryan superbeings first conquered the locals and then built Tiwanaku as a grand monument to their superiority. Kiss spent over a year drafting absurdly detailed plans for the expedition, and Himmler was all in. But then World War II broke out because the Nazis had other terrible ideas to focus on. The Tiwanaku expedition was permanently shelved. Even so, Kiss managed to write 2 novels and a technical book on his theories. Himmler even had one of Kiss's books bound in leather as a holiday gift for Hitler, the Führer himself. I'm having a hard time imagining Hitler unwrapping gifts under the Christmas tree like a giddy schoolboy. What about you? At first glance, this whole story sounds like a rejected Indiana Jones script, but these weren't just the ravings of a crackpot. Kiss's theories were actively woven into Nazi propaganda, helping to fuel their whole master race myth. And his theories didn't end at Tiwanaku being Atlantis. Kiss was a believer of world ice theory, a crazy hypothesis created by Hans Horbiger in the 1890s. The idea is that Earth and all other planets in the solar system are made from ice. Oh yeah, and Earth had 6 moons, 5 of which were destroyed. When the moons were destroyed, they supposedly caused the Great Flood from the Bible. Edmund Kiss believed that destroyed moons caused Atlantis to be destroyed, scattering the Aryan people like ants when their nest is flooded. You should know that no evidence for the world ice theory has been found, though there are still a lot of people who think Tiwanaku was the real Atlantis. Operation Fork, keeping Nazis out of Iceland. The Nazis seem to think just about everywhere was once an Aryan paradise, even the volcanic island nation of Iceland. If it hadn't been for the British, the Nazis would have done some really weird stuff on the island. In the early hours of May 10, 1940, while most Icelanders were enjoying a good night's sleep, British forces suddenly rolled up with Operation Fork. It sounds like a really aggressive dinner party, but was in fact an invasion. The British invasion wasn't quite the same as, say, the Nazi invasion of Poland. They were there to protect the Icelandic people and their freedom. The Brits' first order of business was arresting Dr. Werner Gerlach, the local German consul and full-time Nazi enthusiast. Gerlach wasn't just any normal diplomat. He was on a mission straight from the top, trying to recruit Icelanders for the grand Nazi dream. Because in the twisted minds of Nazi leadership, Iceland was supposed to be an untouched Aryan paradise, full of strong, noble Viking descendants waiting to sign up for world domination. Turns out, they were very wrong. Dr. Gerlach, expecting to find a land of glorious racially pure warriors, instead found regular Icelanders living their lives, completely uninterested in his crazy ideas. He was not pleased. In a huffy little memo which still exists in the National Archives of Iceland, he ranted that Icelanders were pathetic, servile, and utterly disappointing. Dr. Gerlach threw a full-on tantrum because nobody wanted to join his evil club. But why were the Nazis so obsessed with Iceland in the first place? A lot of the blame falls on our old, demented Nazi pal Heinrich Himmler, a man with an unhealthy obsession with Viking mythology. Himmler was like that kid who got way too into Viking stuff and started writing his name in runes. Himmler saw the Vikings as the ultimate proof of Nordic racial superiority, like some kind of blue-eyed axe-wielding poster boys for the Nazi cause. He and his inner circle were convinced Iceland held the spiritual secrets of the so-called master race. One of Himmler's buddies, Dr. Bernhard Kummel, even wrote a book on the spiritual treasures of the Icelandic people, encouraging Germans to take a pilgrimage to Iceland to bask in its racial purity. And there was Dr. Gerlach, tasked with getting Icelanders on board with the Nazi plan. But instead of a proud Aryan brotherhood, he found a bunch of people who wanted nothing to do with him. No spiritual treasures, no racially pure warriors, just regular folks going about their business. Gerlach's Icelandic adventure ended in the most embarrassing way possible. He was thrown in a British jail before being sent back to Germany in a prisoner exchange in 1941. He lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity, presumably haunted by the fact that his great Nazi mission had been thwarted by some unimpressed Icelanders and a bunch of British soldiers with a plan named after a piece of cutlery. Meanwhile, the Allies held on to Iceland for the rest of the war, ensuring that Hitler never got his hands on the strategically important island. And so Iceland remained exactly as it was: cold, independent, and completely uninterested in Nazi insanity. If you're having fun learning about how crazy the Nazis were, be sure to hit that subscribe button right now. The secret Nazi doomsday weapon. Let's take a break from Himmler and his weird pseudo-archaeology to check out an actual Nazi doomsday machine. It turns out sci-fi villains and real Nazi scientists had the same idea: to develop a sun gun. German scientists in the 1920s got together to build a giant space mirror to set stuff on fire. Hate Nazis all you want, but that sounds kind of awesome. The sun gun was a theoretical orbital weapon, sort of like the Death Star's laser, but powered by good old-fashioned sunlight. The idea first came from Hermann Oberth in 1929. He thought to put a 300-foot wide concave mirror in space to focus sunlight onto Earth like some kind of cosmic ant-burning magnifying glass. Then World War II happened, and German scientists working at Hillersleben tried to make it happen for real. Their concept involved a massive mirror made of metallic sodium positioned 5,100 miles above Earth. This thing wouldn't just give you a nasty sunburn, it could boil oceans and incinerate entire cities. This weapon, if functional, would have given the Nazis the power of God. They could have incinerated London like God incinerated Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's all be thankful the Nazis couldn't get it to work. When American officers captured these scientists, they were surprisingly chill about it, saying they could totally build a sun gun if they had another 50 or 100 years to develop the technology. Well, the Nazis didn't have that much time, but they weren't the only ones trying to build the sun gun. The US also found evidence that Japan was trying to develop their own death ray. Not a sun gun exactly, but something with similar apocalyptic energy. Everyone in the 20th century was way too obsessed with turning sci-fi nightmares into reality. Then it ended up being the Americans who finally developed the nuclear bomb. Who needs a sun gun when you have nukes? The Nazi treasure hunt for a Dark Age king. A Nazi official fixated on medieval kings converted a cathedral into a personal shrine. The missing king's body triggered a sequence of bizarre historical fabrications and unauthorized archaeological ventures. This is the tale of how Heinrich Himmler, one of the most infamous figures of the Nazi regime, went on a quest to find the skeleton of a Dark Ages king. Oh, and he failed spectacularly. It all started in 1936 when Hitler's SS, the not-so-merry band of Nazi enforcers, set their sights on Quedlinburg Abbey, a medieval church in Saxony. This was no random tourist attraction. It was supposedly the final resting place of Heinrich I, aka Henry the Fowler, Germany's first king from 919 to 936. Himmler, a former chicken farmer turned professional monster, was completely obsessed with Heinrich, along with a lot of other stuff as you've seen today. Not only did they share a first name, but Himmler apparently saw himself as the king's spiritual reincarnation, which, let's be honest, is a bit of a stretch. Heinrich was a medieval warrior king, and Himmler spent most of his life looking like an evil accountant. Seeing an opportunity to merge history with Nazi propaganda, Himmler decided that Heinrich's grave should become a sacred Nazi site. The SS seized Quedlinburg Abbey and began renovations. By renovations, I mean they gutted the church of Christian symbols, draped it in creepy blue fabric, and added Nazi flags and medieval runes. They even replaced the stained glass window with a giant Nazi eagle. Subtlety was not their strong suit. With the abbey now fully transformed into a fascist fever dream, there was just one small problem. King Heinrich's bones were nowhere to be found. When SS officials opened the crypt, they found nothing, just a sarcophagus of Heinrich's wife, Matilda. Himmler, who had promised a grand spectacle with Heinrich's remains as the star attraction, was forced to admit to his audience that the king's bones were missing. He dramatically blamed political enemies for scattering the remains, though the far likelier explanation was that medieval monks had moved the bones centuries earlier. Perhaps they sensed that one day, lunatics like Himmler might come looking. Giving up was not an option. The SS was ordered to dig up the abbey floors, crack open sarcophagi, and start poking around in the town cemetery. Naturally, this did not endear them to the locals, who were already unimpressed with the whole Nazi takeover of their church situation. After several months of increasingly desperate grave robbing, the SS miraculously discovered, that's discovered with quotations, Heinrich's remains. It was just in time for the 1937 Heinrichsfeier Festival. Pretty convenient. With great fanfare, the SS held a candlelit midnight ceremony in the abbey's crypt, placing their newly discovered royal corpse into an extravagant stone sarcophagus decorated with medieval runes. But guess what? The bones weren't Heinrich's. In reality, the SS had just buried a random skeleton, possibly from one of the many graves they had disturbed during their frenzied digathon. But hey, when has historical accuracy ever mattered to fascists? Himmler's Heinrich obsession finally met its demise when World War II took over Nazi priorities. The SS stopped hosting their creepy Heinrichsfeier Festival, and in 1945 the Allied forces rolled into town and put an end to the Nazi reign over Quedlinburg Abbey. The sarcophagus was emptied, Nazi symbols were removed, and the church was restored to its original purpose. The holiest spear in the land. The Holy Lance is an object of immense mystical power, a talisman that has shaped history and granted its owners supernatural invincibility. The story of the Holy Lance, also called the Spear of Destiny, is packed with intrigue, power, and obsession. According to the Gospel of John, as Jesus hung on the cross, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear. This soldier, later identified as the centurion Longinus, was said to be blind. According to legend, when Jesus' blood splashed onto his eyes, he was miraculously healed. Overcome with faith, he converted to Christianity. What a happy ending, right? Just kidding. Longinus was crucified years later for his beliefs, dying in the same way as Jesus Christ and getting none of the fame for it. His weapon, the Holy Lance, would take on a legendary life of its own. Throughout history, rulers have sought the Holy Lance, believing it grants invincibility. Charlemagne, the great Holy Roman Emperor, reportedly wielded it through 47 victorious military campaigns, until he dropped it. According to legend, he died the very same day. Heinrich I, aka Henry the Fowler, the same German king Himmler was obsessed with that I just told you about, was also said to have possessed it. Later it fell into the hands of Frederick Barbarossa, the mighty warrior empire of the 12th century. In a twist of fate, Barbarossa drowned in a shallow creek just minutes after allegedly dropping the lance. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps. Or maybe this weapon demands absolute loyalty. By the late Middle Ages, the lance was a prized possession of the Holy Roman emperors, stored safely in Nuremberg. But then came Napoleon. In 1796, as French forces invaded, Nuremberg authorities scrambled to move their relics, including the lance, to Vienna. Napoleon, obsessed with its power, tried to capture it after his decisive victory at Austerlitz in 1805. But he was too late. The spear had already been smuggled out of reach. Just a decade later, Napoleon fell, and a century after, Adolf Hitler came along. Long before Adolf Hitler became the Nazi leader, he was a struggling young man in Vienna. Cold, poor, and embittered, he often sought refuge in the Hofburg Museum. There he became fixated on one artifact, the Holy Lance. Years later, Hitler would confide in the philosopher Walter Johannes Stein that he believed the lance held the key to his destiny. Stein even claimed that Hitler radiated a dark charisma when discussing the artifact, as if he were intoxicated by its power. In 1938, after annexing Austria, Hitler seized the lance and moved it to Nuremberg. It remained there until April 30, 1945, when American forces recovered it just 2 hours before Hitler died in his Berlin bunker. Whether the timing was coincidence or eerie fulfillment of the lance's legend, the tale only deepened its mystery. These days, the lance is an enigma with no true history. In 2003, British metallurgist Robert Feather was granted permission to test a holy lance housed in Vienna. His findings showed that the spear was crafted in the 7th century AD, long after Jesus' time. So, is it a legit weapon of supreme power, or is the lance just a fake artifact that every emperor of the last 1,000 years has coveted? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. The search for the Grail. There's only one artifact more powerful than the Holy Lance. Can you guess what it is? Hitler and his inner circle were obsessed with uncovering lost artifacts to support their outlandish racial and mystical beliefs. Among these figures was Otto Rahn, a German medievalist whose deep fascination with the Holy Grail led him into the orbit of the Third Reich. His life and mysterious death remain a source of speculation and intrigue. Born in 1904 in the Oldenwald region of Germany, Otto Rahn was captivated by medieval history and legends from a young age. He was particularly drawn to Parzival, the 13th century epic poem by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The poem tells the tale of the Arthurian knight Percival and his quest for the Holy Grail. Rahn's views changed dramatically when he studied philology at the University of Gießen, where he learned of Heinrich Schliemann, the archaeologist who used the Iliad to locate ancient Troy. Inspired by Schliemann's success, Rahn came to believe that the Grail was not just a myth, but a real object hidden in history. His studies led him to the Cathars, a medieval religious sect in southern France that was exterminated by the Catholic Church during the Albigensian Crusade. Rahn theorized that the Cathars had been the true keepers of the Grail. In 1931, he traveled to Montségur in the Pyrenees, the site of a Cathar fortress and a brutal massacre in 1244. There, he searched for evidence of the relic. He found little but hidden tunnels and legends. Then, in 1933, he published Crusade Against the Grail, detailing his theories. The book sold poorly, but caught the attention of a powerful and dangerous admirer, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler saw Rahn's work as confirmation of his own mystical beliefs. He personally invited Rahn to join his efforts in hunting for treasure, offering financial support and a dedicated research position. In return, Rahn was expected to produce another book by 1937 and a third by 1939. Reluctantly, Rahn accepted, knowing refusal was not an option. Under Himmler's patronage, he conducted research across Europe, including an SS expedition to Iceland to study Norse mythology. Despite his skepticism and lack of enthusiasm for the Nazis, Rahn delivered Lucifer's Court in 1937, proposing a controversial theory that the biblical Lucifer was a misunderstood, positive figure distorted by Christianity. The book was largely ignored by the public, but in Nazi academic circles, Rahn became a celebrated figure. It's like being the most popular guy in the KKK. Not a great friend group, to say the least. Rahn's personal life put him at odds with the SS. He did not fit in with the brutal ranks of Himmler's elite. He was also a heavy drinker, politically liberal, and openly homosexual. These were all traits that made him a marked man in Nazi Germany. Initially, Himmler overlooked Rahn's indiscretions, even when rumors swirled about his Jewish ancestry. However, after multiple affairs with men, including a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer, Himmler's patience wore thin. Rahn was punished with a stint of guard duty at the Buchenwald concentration camp. Witnessing its horrors firsthand shattered him. Shortly afterward, he resigned from the SS in early 1939. Following his resignation, Rahn's mental state deteriorated rapidly. In March 1939, he was found frozen to death in the Austrian Alps. The official explanation was that he went into the mountains to die. He may have performed the Injora, a Cathar ritual of self-starvation and exposure. Otto Rahn's search for the Holy Grail lacked whip-cracking adventures and supernatural encounters, but his life was no less bizarre. Much like the myths he chased, his fate remains shrouded in mystery, forever entwined with the dark obsession of the Third Reich. A Nazi time capsule. There's nothing cooler than finding a time capsule packed with treasures from a bygone era. But is it still cool if it's a Nazi time capsule? Archaeologists recently dug up a long-buried time capsule underneath a former Nazi training facility. They were hoping for something jaw-dropping, maybe secret war plans, a mysterious relic, or at least some vintage propaganda. Instead, what they got was a bunch of boring paperwork and 2 copies of Mein Kampf. One copy wasn't enough? In 1934, in a grand ceremony full of goose-stepping and bad mustaches, the Nazis buried a copper cylinder in the foundation of a training center in what was then Falkenberg, Germany. Now it's Lower Cheniec, Poland. 82 years later, Polish archaeologists had to dig 20 feet through concrete, navigate standing water, and avoid Nazi landmines to retrieve the capsule. When they finally cracked it open, the contents included coins, newspapers, photographs of Hitler and his buddies, official documents, and Mein Kampf. No treasure map, no lost artifacts, not even a 1934 postcard. Believe it or not, this is a common problem with time capsules. They tend to be stuffed with things that were probably important at the time, but are now just meh. Nazis were so delusional, they really thought future generations would be fascinated by tax records, city council meeting minutes, and commemorative plaques. A lot of time capsules end up being total failures, like the 17-town capsules misplaced by Corona, California, or the Empire State Building's 1930 time capsule that was cracked open 50 years later, only to find water had ruined everything inside. The Poland capsule is unique because of the dramatic contrast between the people who buried it and the people who found it. Usually time capsules are a love letter from one generation to another. This one was more like an unwanted chain email from history's worst relatives. In fact, Polish officials had to display the two Mein Kampf copies face down, since anything that could be seen as promoting Nazi ideology is illegal in Poland. The items are now heading to a museum, along with a lot of commentary on how the whole Nazi project ended badly for, well, everyone. They found no evidence of the Aryan race and found no superweapons like Thor's hammer or the Holy Grail. They couldn't even bury a half-decent time capsule. What are your thoughts on Nazi archaeology? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and come back soon for more videos.